employees across the board are really expecting to come into an empathetic organization, and they care about having empathetic leaders. And the CEOs are thinking that they've got that nailed. That's what the data showed, that, yeah, we're super empathetic, and there's a huge gap. And so people are demanding something that they're not getting. And then we see the HR people in the middle, caught between like this C staff that thinks it's all good and the staff that thinks it is not.
This is L&D Unlocked, a series for L&D and HR professionals looking to unlock the future of learning and development. Presented by BizLibrary, L&D Unlocked is an ongoing series where we speak to industry experts and thought leaders about the future of work, workplace trends, and how your organization can prepare today for the challenges of tomorrow. Learn more at bizlibrary.com.
Welcome to today's episode of L&D Unlocked. I'll be your host, Chris Elliot, Chief Revenue Officer at BizLibrary, and so excited to be joined today by Minette Norman, expert on inclusive leadership, co-author of the Psychological Safety Playbook, author of the recently released The Boldly Inclusive Leader, and founder and principal of Minette Norman Consulting, where she works directly with organizations to create compassionate and empathetic leaders. I know you're going to be excited to hear her point of view today. All of this informed by her 30-year career in technology, which has kind of led her to this place on her journey. So without further ado, Minette, you want to give us a little bit about your background and kind of what led you to the place that you're at today?
Very, very happy to do that. And thank you for having me, Chris. Yeah, I think we should talk about briefly the 30 years I spent in the software industry, because that is what led me to the work that I'm doing today. And I was here in Silicon Valley in California. I started as an individual contributor back in 1989. And I worked in tech until 2019 and ended up really about 10 years in taking on management leadership roles, bigger and bigger ones, until my last job, I was VP of engineering at a big software company. And I was really trying to drive change at scale. And what I realized while I was doing that job is that this is not just a technology challenge, which everyone thought it was. It's like, we need to modernize our tools. We need to get engineers working together. And when I realized this is about culture change, this is about how we interact, how we behave, how we listen to one another, how we may be inadvertently marginalizing some people. And that's really what got me interested in the work that I'm doing today. And I got a big education in human interaction and empathy and collaboration and inclusion and psychological safety and all the things that we were not really talking about a lot in tech at the time. Now I see that has changed, but I felt like we just needed to accelerate how do we interact as human beings in the workplace, because too many of us are being silenced. And often, even though I was in a position of privilege and power as a VP, I often felt like my voice wasn't welcome. I was not necessarily part of the dominant insiders group. And so I would find myself really hesitating before speaking up sometimes. And I was not the only one. And I realized, and have certainly learned, that in order to bring out the best in every employee we have, and to really tap into the genius and brilliance of a diverse workforce, we need to change our cultures and how we really do invite every voice to be heard. And so I finally left in 2019 and decided to start my own business where I can help many leaders, as many as possible, really create those cultures where everyone can thrive.
I mean, one of the things I think is so fascinating about your journey here, it's quite common that we get guests and clients in inclusivity-focused arenas that come up through the HR organization. They come in with a people kind of centric lens, and what I think is fascinating is that that's not your journey. You came up from the business side, yes, and kind of independently arrived at the conclusion that these changes, in addition, I would say, to just being the right thing to do, are directly tied to business results.
Yes.
For me, I'm wrong, but I think it was the desire to drive better business results that led you to the conclusion that these sorts of topics are what are going to help move the needle there. Is that right?
That is right. And I think that that is one of the kind of unique angles that I come from in or come to from because I have seen the same thing that a lot of the people doing what I'm doing either come from an HR or psychology background. And where I come from is just having lived and breathed the work life in engineering, because I was always in product and engineering. And realizing I think this is where we go wrong. And this is where I still think leaders go wrong, is that we think about culture as something off to the side, that we're going to work on when we have some time. We're going to work on improving our corporate culture, but we have business imperatives that we have to meet. And what I realized is we are not going to meet our business imperatives. We're not going to transform how we develop software unless we can change how we interact, and that's the culture. And so the conclusion I've come to and the work I'm trying to do is not to have this false dichotomy of it's either business or culture, but to say these two drive one another and that we need to work on them at the same time with the same importance, and not think that culture is a nice to have to achieve business results. It's an imperative. And so that you're right, that's where I'm coming from and how I came to that conclusion, that we're not going to go through transformation unless we also transform our culture.
I love that. And I think it's not the same kind of ecosystem it was 5-10 years ago. I think more and more of the C-suite shares that perspective. They've had that realization. But if you're on the L&D team or HR team and you're struggling to get executive support, this is the episode to share. Minette didn't come up from the classical HR side. She came from the business team and still arrived at this conclusion. I think it's fantastic. Minette, in your opening, you said something that reminded me of the way that your book, The Fully Inclusive Leader, opens. You mentioned in the opening of this episode, potentially unintentionally marginalizing someone. And the book opens with recounting kind of a CEO address where absolutely good intentioned was looking to solicit questions from the audience, which I think the intent was well enough. But despite the best of intentions, it may have had a very different impact than perhaps the one that was intended. And I was wondering if you could speak for a moment on maybe some of the misconceptions we have about creating a tone of inclusivity and some of the best practices that you'd recommend.
Yeah, and of course it's a big topic, so I'll try to summarize it fairly quickly. I think the problem is, and this is for any leader at any level, but especially when you reach the C-suite, you have this feeling that you need to show up as really perfect and impermeable. And if you're getting up, as I was describing in the book, to do an all hands and you're doing a Q&A, that you better have the answers. But what happens is that we forget we are human, no matter if we're the CEO or any level of leader. And it's okay to not have the answer. But what gets us in trouble is when we, in this case, get defensive and someone asks us a challenging question that we're not prepared to answer, and we then make that person feel bad. We embarrass them, we humiliate them because we are uncomfortable. And so what I'm really advocating for is that leaders can show up not having all the answers and show up as human beings, which really does invite that feeling that we are all human beings together, and that the CEO or any executive is not up on some pedestal. And so to be able to say, I don't have a great answer for that, as opposed to, how dare you ask me that question, which is sort of what happened in this scenario that I depict. That would definitely create more trust and more sort of fellowship across the population of the company, as opposed to this, I am not going to answer your question. I'm not going to deign to answer that question. And therefore, no one is going to dare to speak up again because they've just seen someone get shut down. So I think some of the mistakes that leaders make is that feeling of like, I need to be perfect when I get up there and I need to have all the answers. But instead, to really welcome the divergent perspectives across the company or organization, and also to be willing to ask for help. Like if you get up there and you don't have the answer, how about, is there anyone else here who might be able to fill in the blanks? And then that's inclusive and that's welcoming of other points of view. But we don't do that often enough. And we also get into that automatic defensive reaction, which is never going to serve us well and definitely goes against inclusion and psychological safety.
It's fascinating. Can I ask you a question, a little atypical for this podcast, and maybe the parallel doesn't exist, but I'll ask the question, get your thoughts on it. one of the major changes that's happening right now on the go-to-market side, I'm our chief revenue officer. I lead customer acquisition efforts, and undoubtedly one of the hottest topics right now is just a sweeping change in customer expectations, and largely driven by digital natives who are now decision makers in the workplace. And one of the kind of core recurring topics is there's so much more educated today because they can self-serve, find information that when they engage with us as a vendor, their expectations of those calls are very different today than what they were 5-10 minutes ago, because they know so much more. And getting back to your kind of internal communications example, I wonder if a similar dynamic is in play, that expectations have changed in some ways because of information parity, that employees just fundamentally have a lot more information at their disposal today and don't always need the leader to be the one source of truth, because they're quite informed, probably more informed than they've ever been. But I could be drawing a parallel that perhaps doesn't exist. Do you think this is a shift that's happened with employee expectations, or have these expectations always been there and we've just been missing as a leadership cohort?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I do think expectations have changed, even for the workforce that the newer generations and the digital natives are joining. They want purpose. They want to come into a company that feels like it's aligned with their values. And maybe we always had that, but it was sort of a nice to have, right? Whereas now people are demanding that I'm going to come work for a company where I'm aligned with their values, where the leadership embraces diversity, equity, inclusion, creates a safe culture. Empathy is something that is super important to people today that we never used to talk about. I mean, there's lots of research on that. You're probably familiar with the State of Workplace Empathy report that comes out every year. Yes. And that I found fascinating. Here's where I see a big, if you look at this year's data on that, employees across the board are really expecting to come into an empathetic organization, and they care about having empathetic leaders. And the CEOs are thinking that they've got that nailed. That's what the data showed, that, yeah, we're super empathetic, and there's a huge gap. And so people are demanding something that they're not getting. And then we see the HR people in the middle, caught between like this C staff that thinks it's all good and the staff that thinks it is not. And so finding that common ground. I think your question about, yes, it's not just internal, but it's external. Customers are expecting certain things when they come to a company for help, and employees are demanding something too. And so I do think that the paradigms must shift. Yeah. And leaders, that's why I'm advocating a really different model of leadership.
A bit. So speaking of leadership, I'm looking at some of the notes I took from the book, and that's a good segue. One of the call outs, I thought it was really impactful, was that being a human leader means showing up as an imperfect person with all your strengths and all your flaws. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that concept a little bit when it comes to creating, environments that do promote empathy in a better relationship in the team dynamics.
Well, I think it goes back to sort of what we were talking about, in that maybe older models of, and I'm not talking about like just the age of the leader. I'm talking about in the past, models of leadership were that there was this command and control, and the leader is really in charge of every single decision and has all the knowledge. Whereas today, we know that it's very different in what people are expecting. And as you said, that they're showing up not expecting necessarily that the leader has every single answer, but that everyone gets to participate in some way. And so I think what really builds trust and human connection is when a leader does show up, that I'm human, I've had my own struggles, this is what I'm really good at, this is where I might need some help. And I'm really enlisting the help of the people in my organization. And, I certainly experienced this myself as I went up through leadership, feeling like I don't dare make any mistakes. And then, here's an example that I have in the book, and I think this was really illustrative for me, is that at one point I made a decision that I later had to reverse because I didn't have all the information when I made the decision. I was leading a team, got new information, had to change my decision and say, look, we're moving this position from this geo to this geo. And my first thought is, oh gosh, they're going to think that I'm an idiot, that I'm an incompetent leader. And instead, the feedback I got was so overwhelmingly positive. And it was, Minette, we really appreciate that you listened and that you were willing to change your mind when you got additional information, that engendered trust and confidence that I could admit a mistake and that I could then make a different decision based on new information. And I feel like that's where we're so afraid often as leaders, that we must just stick with that decision, even in the face of new information, because it's going to make us seem weak. And I want to really reverse that. And thinking is that I mean, obviously you're not going to change every decision, but if something comes up that really does mean you need to reverse something you thought of, be open to that and say, you know what, I don't have all the answers. And I so appreciate that you were willing to share that with me so we could all move forward in a better direction. That's what I mean by being more human. That's one example of it.
You know, if I could return with an example, I was so proud. This happened this week, and obviously we try to drink our own champagne. You know, the principles and concepts we're talking about on the show are principles that we try to live by here at BizLibrary. And I had one of my team members called me this week with just a personal event that popped up in her life that she had to take care of that day. It was unexpected, and she needed to sign off. And I asked her, like, hey, no problem at all. And would you like me to manage it? Like, I got it. I can touch base with your team. And I was so impressed with her answer. She said, no, I want to let them know that I'm signing off for the day due to a personal emergency, because I want to demonstrate and make sure that they know that when they have personal emergencies that all of us have, because we're human and we have lives that go on outside of work and things happen, that they can just let me know that it doesn't have to be a big goes up the chain in a massive communication. I love that she was so intentional about even something as I have to exit the day, doing that in a way that promotes an acknowledgement that these are just kind of things that happen, and when they do, it's not a big deal. You can just let me know and we can manage through it.
Exactly. I really think the more, and I use the word human a lot intentionally, because I think the more we just show up that way as humans who have lives outside of work, that we don't shut down our humanity when we walk into the door, whether physically or virtually, but that, it's a continuum. And so we don't have to hide that we are human. I think the more we can show up that way, the more we will have better connections and relationships in the workplace.
I totally agree. Minette, could I circle back to one more thing that you said right out of the gate in the intro that I took a note, I thought was fascinating. You mentioned in your introduction that even though that you were a VP, you were in a position kind of organizationally of power, you didn't always necessarily feel like an insider. And I think that's a dynamic that exists way more often than we acknowledge or care to talk about, that we don't have inclusivity problems because we have representation and leadership, but that in and of itself is not psychological safety or inclusivity. I think you experienced that. And I was wondering maybe if you could touch on that for a moment.
Yes, and I think it's really, as you said, it's way more common than we may acknowledge. And that's why representation is not enough. Representation matters, but the culture of inclusivity means that yes, we have representation, and every single one of those people has a voice that is welcomed and respected. And what I found often, these insider and outsider dynamics, even within a leadership team, and that is like there was sort of the way I would describe it in the words I often use is the dominant group, the majority group. And then there are all of those who feel a little bit different and a little bit on the outside. And I was one of them. And part of it was I was one of the few women in the leadership team. But it wasn't just being a woman, the women-man dynamic. It was also, I had not come up with the same background as many of the people, and that even though I was leading engineering, I didn't have an engineering background. I started out in technical writing and I did all these other things. And so it was a little bit like I was just not quite fitting in. And then also, I think my perspective, and this is where we think about like cognitive diversity. I think the way I thought about things was often very people-centric. And I was often up against like only talking about technology or only talking about business results. And I kept coming back to talking about the people and the dynamics and the culture. And that wasn't always welcome. And sometimes I would either be ignored, right? You'd be in a meeting, I'd say something and it was just totally ignored, or a little eye roll, or, just some of those little, we would call them microaggressions maybe, but it made me feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't speak up. Maybe my voice isn't really welcome. And, I had another colleague of mine who she was hired as the VP of design when I was VP of engineering. And the two of us were often what I would say challenging the status quo. We were really trying to drive change. And a lot of the leadership team just didn't welcome it or dismissed it. And so that's how you feel like you're not really part of that insider club. And then I often would choose to just shut up because it was too hard. It took there was too much of a tax and a burden to always be speaking up and being met with resistance. And so we go quiet. And I saw that so much, is that people have really important things to say, but the effort it takes to be heard can be just so lonely and so exhausting. And so we hold back. And that's what I'm really fighting against when I talk about creating inclusive team dynamics and minimizing these insider and outsider dynamics.
Again, I think to pulling at the heartstrings on talk about doing these things because it's the right thing to do. And how that must feel to be on the other end of that table where you do feel marginalized. But then I'd also bring it back to what a loss of production that you have such a capable person here at the table that can't affect change, or at least at the rate that you're capable of, because of an inclusion problem. That's why I get back to me. It's the right thing to do, but it's also squarely aligned with business objectives.
Yes.
That's Minette. On that note, let's take a quick break to hear from the sponsor of today's episode, BizLibrary. It'll be less than a minute. We've got a couple more topics I want to hit on before we break. So we'll start it up again here in just a moment.
At BizLibrary, we know that employee development and retention have never been more critical to your business. We help you build learning programs that create safe and inclusive work environments, elevate employee skills, and develop leaders who drive results. So now, you can take award-winning BizLibrary content and put it to work to help overcome your biggest challenges. BizLibrary, where learning happens.
Well, welcome back. If you are wondering, Minette and I talked about this before we officially started the episode. I think this one will be known as the Elton John episode, because if you're wondering what the background is, it has nothing to do with BizLibrary or L&D Unlocked. I have a party coming up this weekend, and it's Elton John themed, and I didn't want to take all the books down, so we'll just call this one the Minette Elton John episode from here on out. But Minette, to pick it back up, there was another topic that came up in the book that I was like, this is fantastic. It is actionable, and it's something that we can make progress on today. We don't need to wait. And it was your statement that you can improve team culture one meeting at a time. This doesn't have to be a massive years-long project, top-down funded. That there are things that all of us can do as soon as this podcast is over to start making small improvements each day. And I was wondering for the audience that's listening, if you could share your perspective on some of those things that you can do one meeting at a time.
It's one of my favorite topics because, just as you said, it is so practical and actionable, and you can't really underestimate how much meetings reflect the company culture and how you can then influence by changing how you run your meetings. And if you do nothing, and this is sort of what I was referring to before, if you just let meetings take their natural course, what you get are these insider and outsider dynamics. And there's even research that shows, like, in a typical meeting of 8 people, 2 people do all of the talking, or almost all of the talking, and the other 6 don't really contribute for whatever reason. Power dynamics, they don't feel welcome. So I think one of the very first things we can do to run better meetings is to appoint someone, and I would rotate this role. Don't let it always fall on the women or minorities. Rotate the role of facilitator and say, I'm going to have someone in each meeting who's going to make sure that all the voices are heard, that not one person is dominating all the time, and that we hear from everyone. And like, how are we going to do that? Are we going to do turn taking? Sometimes that's useful. If you have something where you really do want to get everyone's input quickly, go around the table, go around the virtual table, and no one speaks twice until everyone speaks once kind of rule. But also be looking out for those little dynamics where someone gets interrupted. I was just sharing before the break. I would share an idea and sometimes just get completely interrupted and no one would even acknowledge my idea. Let's make sure, just say, hold on 1 second. Before we move on, Chris didn't get to finish his thought. Chris, please, what were you saying before we move on? And then you get to actually be heard and you feel like you're included in this meeting as opposed to completely ignored. So those kinds of things are really important. And then before the meeting, this is the other thing we don't do enough, although some companies do this, is to give people time to prepare, especially if you're going to be talking about something important. We know that people with different processing styles, different first languages, they may need some time to prepare before a meeting. And if you don't do that, then it's going to be the most dominant, most extroverted person in the meeting who's going to start talking. So give people reading materials, say, come prepared to talk about this, here's an agenda, and then that helps level the playing field when you get into the meeting. And one of the other things that I think is really important, because it's very hard to be the person who dissents from the group, is to actively ask for dissenting viewpoints, because it's very tempting to converge on whatever the dominant idea is, but to actually say, okay, we've heard everyone's converging on this one idea. How about if we hear just some devil's advocate? Who wants to play devil's advocate? What are we missing here? What are we not thinking of? Because that will invite those people who think differently. So those are just a few ideas. And one of the things that I am actually optimistic about is, having seen how we've been working the last few years when it's much more virtual or hybrid, is how these tools like Zoom and Teams and all these kinds of technologies actually can help us be more deliberately inclusive. And what I mean by that is, some people don't like to speak. And so giving a chat option, often you've probably noticed this too. If you're in a meeting and there are a bunch of people who are unmuting themselves, there are also those people who are willing to put something in a chat, but they don't necessarily want to speak. That's another way to hear voices that we didn't used to hear. So I really believe in leveraging the technology we have, whether it's polling or chat or virtual whiteboards, that enable people who don't particularly like to speak in public to still contribute their ideas.
It's so smart. I think we're going to end on that topic. Before we get there, you said that it so resonated on the kind of forcing alternate viewpoints. Okay, we've all gravitated towards this. Let's quick time out. Who, and I love how you phrased it. I think is so important. When you phrase it as who wants to play devil advocate, you even solicit in a way that says you're not even necessarily advocating for it. I'm just asking you to play the part as if you were. I think that is so smart. It reminds me, and funny enough, you can barely see him here in the corner. Chris Hadfield, who was a commander of the International Space Station, he went viral for playing the guitar on the ISS. His book has a principle that I try to apply quarterly with our team, and the concept is visualize disaster. And it's essentially, we love to put our plans together, and the best plans, and we focus on them and we iterate and all that. And he has this principle of, let's pretend for a moment, the shuttle exploded. Why did it happen? In his world, because he's an astronaut. In our world, we go through that. I have our team go through that exercise of, okay, let's pretend it's December 31st and we missed our business objectives. Your business objectives are A, B, and C. What most likely contributed to that? In Minette, it's fascinating. Sometimes they really are highly abstract black swan events. Sometimes it's solicited input that is like, that is going to happen. Like that 100%, you just really now have the psychological safety to share something that has been eating you alive and you didn't want to talk about it. And holy smokes, now we can go address that before the clock runs out. So I think that concept of, whether it's forcing alternate viewpoints or maybe a similar concept, visualizing disaster, I've had really good results with that opening up dialogue. That, again, not only does it make more people comfortable in a work setting, it's directly helped us on the results side as well.
Yes, that's such a good practice. We even talk about that in the psychological safety playbook. And it's not our concept, but it's called, like, the idea of a post-mortem after something happens, that
Yes.
you then dissect it, but instead to do the pre-mortem, just as you're saying, like what could possibly go wrong, and
I love
imagine
that.
all of the worst case scenarios, because then you can talk about them, right? As you
Right.
said. Yeah.
Love it. Hey, why don't we wrap it up today with a topic that is pervasive? You alluded to, hey, there are some benefits to this hybrid world that we're all living in. There's some technology that we can take advantage of that can help with inclusivity. It also comes with a lot of struggles. We're approaching 4 years post, the start of lockdown, and I don't think anyone claims to have figured it out yet. Like, and still, we're struggling to get into a groove of how do we engage, create meaningful relationships, safety in a digital workspace. And I would love to hear your point of view, whether it be leveraging the technology or tactics that we can take as leaders to try to have the best possible environment, particularly in digital and remote first worlds.
I think that it could be either much worse than being in person, or better, or certainly as good, but we have to be deliberate and intentional about how we run things in this high, especially in some ways when everyone was virtual, when we first had the shutdown and no one was in the office. In some ways that was the great equalizer, because everyone was in the same boat. Now, I'm not saying everyone had the same home circumstances, but we were all just on Zoom or whatever. I think it's tricky right now when we have some companies were saying, return to the office, there's the in-office mandate, but then there's still always the people that are in different parts of the world who are not in, quote unquote, the headquarters. And this is what I experienced even before the pandemic, is that we had the headquarters concept, like we were a US based company, but very global. And there was almost like a two-tier system. It was like, who's in the US headquarters office has more visibility, has more access to executives, and everyone in the rest of the world was kind of this afterthought. And you get that now with the return to office versus whoever's hybrid or virtual. And so we do have to be very deliberate that we're not having inequality in the way people get access to opportunities, and make sure that we are, we're not just rewarding the proximity bias, the people who are closest to us. So we do have to be deliberate. We have to make sure that if we have a conversation in a physical office, that then we are looping in the people who are not there, and that they're not missing out on either information or opportunity. And so, part of it is technology, but a lot of it is, I would say, intentionality about how do we behave and how do we create inclusive cultures in a hybrid and virtual world and in a very global world. And I think part of it is not just technology, but also creating opportunities for connection that are beyond just talking. Like, we have so many meetings, right? And so we'll have a meeting, have our staff meeting, whatever it is. And if we only talk about business, we are really going to miss out on that human element. And so I do think we need to create either informal or more formal ways of socializing virtually. And, I'm one of the clients I was talking to, they just do this like random virtual coffee where you're assigned someone to have a virtual coffee with, and it's all over the globe because they're very global, and you just get to meet someone and have an informal chat. I think these things go a long way, and we shouldn't underestimate the need for human connection, however we do it. And I think we need to pay attention to that and not just have it be all business focused. And one other last thing I'll add is I was working with a client in San Francisco, and she had a global team, and she was saying, we just get straight down to business and we don't really know each other. And I said, well, do you ever spend any time as a team just having chit chat, like what people did over the weekend, or something about food, or things that are pretty universal? She goes, we've never done that. And, just like have 5 minutes at the start of a meeting, or 10 minutes where you can have something informal. And she said when they started to do that, it was really game changing, because they just started to get to know each other as human beings, as opposed to finance people or whatever, right?
I totally agree that sometimes a seemingly marginal change, particularly in level of effort, can have big impacts. We experienced something very similar at Biz. With our team is now majority remote, and we were struggling with just information dissemination, like everyone else, or like most.
Right.
Not just how do we do it, but also how do we do it in a way that's engaging, because part one is getting them the info, and then part two is anybody actually going to consume this in a way that matters? And we made one change that took very little effort and just got such positive feedback, which was, instead of cycling through our leadership team, which we had been doing, and typically via text in some capacity, whether it be through Messenger or email, we just switched to video updates so that they were on demand and you could see the leader and hear from her and get the updates in a way that, even though it was an on-demand video, just felt so much more human to get back to one of the recurring words of the episode. It had a huge impact for us, I feel like, in terms of employee engagement and connectedness with the business on both the professional and personal level. Minette, I could keep going, but I have to stop somewhere. And I think this is a good pause point. I got so much from this. I know our audience did too. Minette, if individuals want to connect with you, stay in touch, follow you, get your book, what's the best way for them to do that? How can we stay in touch with Minette?
I'd say the two best ways is my website is minettenorman.com, and there are links to everything there, the book, getting in touch with me. And I'm also on LinkedIn, and I love to connect with people and engage in dialogue and hear what people are struggling with. And so, yeah, Minette Norman on LinkedIn as well.
Fantastic. And you know how to find us, bizlibrary.com. So thanks so much for tuning in, and make sure to check out the next episode of L&D Unlocked. We'll see you there.
This episode has been brought to you by BizLibrary. Head to bizlibrary.com for more information.